This is KEDT Community Focus. I'm Rob Boscamp. The 2025 hurricane season officially begins this month, and I had the privilege to speak with FRONTLINE correspondent Laura Sullivan in Hurricane Helene's Deadly Warning, the latest episode of the PBS documentary series. Laura revisits a decade's worth of reporting on storms such as last year's Hurricane Helene and 2017's Hurricane Harvey. The episode looks at how, as climate change-related storms become more frequent and severe in the U.S., there are concerns that incremental attempts to mitigate against future flooding across the country aren't going to be enough. Right now, PBS and NPR is airing the latest episode of Frontline, Hurricane Helene's Deadly Warning. You go on the ground in North Carolina, you revisit Houston. Hearing and sharing the stories that you share in this documentary are never easy to hear, especially the heartbreaking ones. So just kind of recap what you felt when you were hearing these stories and your motivation to share those stories.
So much of what we found when we first got to North Carolina was this unbelievable devastation. Especially, I've seen so many of these storms over the past 20 years and covering these things. And this was, the level of devastation was just beyond anything that I had seen, where 26 feet of water had come slamming down Western North Carolina's mountains and just overtook these communities, tearing homes into matchsticks. This was not a storm where the water came up and it flooded everyone's homes and then it slowly receded and everybody had to dig out from that. There was nothing left in so many of these communities. They were either just gone or the semi-trailers were toppled on top of houses in piles of cars and homes that had come off their foundations. I think the question that we started asking is, why, if the storms are getting worse and more frequent over time, how are communities going to prepare for this in the future? And what we really found looking at some of the storms we had been to in the past is that communities are not prepared, not even the ones who threw so much time and effort into these storms. And you've seen that in Texas as well with Hurricane Harvey that came through Houston. We went back and took a look at how that recovery went, and we could find very few people that thought it had gone well.
Recently here in the Rio Grande Valley, we had some heavy rainfall. That area is still recovering from flooding just a few months ago. How important is it for South Texas residents to be prepared, especially when they're looking at stories that are in this documentary?
One of the big shifts that we found that experts were talking to us about was this shift toward heavy rainfall. There was a perception for decades now that the storms that people would face would come from a tidal surge, would come from a hurricane coming in off the coast. But so much of the damage is coming from the hurricane that comes in off the coast or the large storm and lingers and stays for days, dropping this incredible rainfall on communities. And that rainfall then starts moving and sweeping things away with it. That's the danger that Americans are facing now that was not as significant in the past. And it's tricky because the federal government, FEMA, through the federal government, is not mapping for precipitation. They are not mapping for heavy rainfall. They're mapping for the more traditional storms. So we found that 2 times as many Americans are facing a risk from these storms that have no idea that they are even at risk. There are some programs that the federal government tries to put together to help people during the storms, but mostly it's up to states and local communities to try to figure out how they're going to build for these storms and build back. And that's been very difficult for a lot of communities.
Do you feel that mitigation could be helped with research and preparation, or is there something more that needs to be done to help prepare for those storms?
We stood on the banks of the Swannanoa River in a town outside of Asheville, North Carolina, and everything seemed to be gone. There was people missing. There were people who were dead. They were trapped under cars up against homes. And yet, as we stood there, there was this one row of duplexes that we saw. And they were some of the only man-made structures still standing. And when you looked at these structures, you could see that they were pulled back from the river's edge. They were elevated high in the air. They had these strong concrete foundations. They had flood vents in the concrete foundations that open under the pressure of water. And these homes survived. And as we stood there, I mean, the obvious question as you're looking at this is, why are these homes still here and everything else is gone? And then the second question is, why wasn't everybody's home built like this? Because these people just have some cosmetic repairs and then they get to come back. And what we found over the course of this project was that if the federal government is not going to make regulations, people don't want to be told what to do on their own property, that they're going to have to make those decisions for themselves. And in the vacuum of any kind of regulation, people think that there's a lot of regulation with this, but there's very little actually. What you do on your property and how you rebuild, unless you're in these small floodplain areas, is really up to you. But in this vacuum, we found a lot of special interests. We found the home builders lobby that is really pushing for people to build with older codes in some cases, in less resilient ways in some cases, and using older materials, which will make them not withstand a storm. They say they are protecting people's affordability, the home's affordability. They are trying to get more Americans into homes. But the critics that we talked to said that's simply not true, that you can build an affordable home that is also safe.
I think it was in one of the Hurricane Harvey segments, somebody had said that the storm's getting bigger and that we would have to live with water and eventually not occupy the areas where flooding occurs. What reality do you see playing out as these storms get bigger? Is it one where builders are going to spend money to work around these conditions, or is it one where businesses and builders continue to look out for their own interests?
Without question, development has the upper hand, and they have had it in every community we went back and visited. The pressure to develop communities is so overwhelming. It's not only that people want more homes, there's a housing affordability crisis right now, but also that the local communities want these new homes. This is a tax base. People want to be in charge of growing communities. The decision to say, look, putting homes up right next to a river is maybe not, putting trailers in the case that we saw in a lot of places, is maybe not the best place to build. That's a difficult decision for local officials to make. And because they want that tax base, they want that community. And it's very hard to take a look at a community that's already there and say, you know what, we're going to need to buy this community out and turn this into a park. At the end of the day, when that's actually done, most people in the community are really happy. It's a beautiful park. Everybody loves it. And then everybody else's home values go up around it. But at the time when you're saying people shouldn't live in this particular area, it's a very difficult thing to do. In Houston, the idea was that what we saw when we were down there was this sort of mentality that you could build your way out of the threat. You could engineer your way out of the problem. You could create these enormous dams. You could try to make them work. You could build bayous. You could build storm canals, storm drainage systems, storage canals, these enormous human innovative projects. And at the end of the day, Harvey was still too much water. And now, 8 years later, as the officials there told us, what the progress they've made has really been incremental. And if Harvey happened again, everybody would flood again.
Frontline and NPR looks back on a decade of reporting on these disasters. How important is it for communities to have stations like PBS and NPR in those communities providing that information?
One of the most important things we heard in North Carolina in those initial days was that everybody was getting their information from public radio. They couldn't get onto cable, the internet was down, their cell phones weren't working, but they could turn on the radio. And everybody was saying that that's where they were getting information about their water. That's where they were learning how to get to the hospital. This is where they were learning about the recovery process and how to even find grants. Some of our NPR member stations were just on the air 24/7 trying to help these communities come back because they are members of the community. They live and breathe everything there with everybody. And so many of our colleagues were devastated by these storms as well and came in every day because this is the job we do, right? This is why we do what we do. And a lot of people forget how powerful it is to have a news gathering service in your own community that speaks with your community's voice until it's gone. Having grown up in a lot of local papers that are now gone, those communities are worse off for it. And if we lose our member stations, we'll lose that voice for people out there.
Correspondent Laura Sullivan joining me. Laura, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. This has been Community Focus. Thanks again to PBS, NPR, and Frontline's Laura Sullivan for joining me today. You can watch the latest episode of Frontline, Hurricane Helene's Deadly Warning at pbs.org. You can also check out this and other episodes of Community Focus wherever you get your podcasts.